Hello and welcome to today's discussion on episode 1 of White Rose Commander's gameplay. Now, if you've not watched the video yet, pause this and go watch it because there will be spoilers ahead. So yeah, go and do that and then come back. Now, if you've done that, I get the honour of discussing how the game went as the victor. And today we're going to be talking about how Tiamat panned out. But it turns out Tiamat is very powerful. And I think some of the key moments in the game were fairly obvious. I felt like I was quite ahead for a lot of it. I felt like I had a lot of answers to a lot of the things people were throwing in my way. I mean, Matt's flying hydras were definitely problematic, to say the least. And I was so grateful to have something like Earthquake Dragon in my deck where it's got flying and trample to start to be able to counteract those, because otherwise he was just chump blocking everything in the air. And it has kind of told me that in the future I need to put more things in that give my creatures trample. But in terms of the game itself, I think certain key moments panned out, and I'm going to just kind of roughly talk through some of those. So I think one of them from my perspective was getting Tyrant's Familiar out. Now this happened slightly later on in the game. This was essential for taking out Matt's hydras because, luckily for me, none of them were above 7 toughness. So getting Tyrant's Familiar out was an essential part of my winning strategy, really. Now, this has also helped with something like Thrakus the Butcher when he came out, and this is where I think the deck really picked up pace, and it was suddenly Thrakus the Butcher. If I get another swing in, all my dragons, especially Earthquake Dragon, are going to be dealing double damage. So it was quite obvious that they needed to get rid of everything. And when Matt Curse of the Swined loads of our dragons, I completely understood the rationale for that. But I think some of the other key points in the game were really, for me, my decisions on a card like Split the Spoils. Now, this is where I got to exile 5 cards from my graveyard and put them into 2 piles, and Matt got to choose which ones to bring back. Now, the piles I chose were in one pile Thrakus the Butcher, Tyrant's Familiar, and Renari, which is the dragon that gives all my other dragons flash. Now, I knew that Matt did not want Tyrant's Familiar coming back out on the game onto the table because of how powerful it was against his hydras. But what I did think was actually going to be more powerful in the long run was something like Miriam the Sentinel Worm, giving me double dragons, and something as simple as Red Dragon. So Red Dragon reads, it's got flying, it's a 4/4, and when it enters the battlefield, it deals 4 damage to each opponent. At this point, everyone's life totals were quite low. So if I could get Miriam with a Red Dragon out, suddenly I'm dealing 8 damage just from playing my dragons. Let alone then if I played out a Tiamat again and got double Tiamat triggers, I actually don't think I had any dragons pretty much left in the deck at that point. But I think that was a really interesting point in the game where I kind of made a decision. Do I want to be obviously heavy aggro with something like Tyrant's Familiar and Thrakus, or do I go something more subtle? And I think it actually panned out. I didn't actually have to do it in the end, but I think that was a key moment for sealing everyone's fate, really. And so I think this deck was far more resilient than I thought it would be, considering the high mana value of everything in it. The other final thing to point out is that I also did have a Hellkite Courser in my hand, which allows me to bring out my commander and put with haste on the battlefield and remove it at the end of the turn. So I had that as a backup as well. So all in all, I did feel like, although Matt's hydras and flying hydras were hard, and Jack was very worrying at the start with his slivers, as the game progressed and I got into enough mana value to be able to just keep playing out dragons and recurring them, I do feel like it was me in the driving seat all the way, which surprised me, I think, as much as the other two, given the fact that this is such a new deck. So that's a brief discussion of the game. In the future, we will probably have more than one of us discussing it, so it's not just me lecturing on how great I thought dragons were. Let's talk about Tiamat, the Queen of the Dragons. So we're going to have some talks about what I did, how I designed the deck, and really it all starts from I bought a booster box for Battle for Baldur's Gate. And in this booster box, I got Miriam the Sentinel Worm. And I was originally thinking, this is exactly the type of deck I want to build. Let's do some dragons, just pull together anything from the booster box, but let's have two of them each time. And, that was the tactic I was going to go for. And I was lucky enough to get some dragons like Earthquake Dragon in that booster box. And, I thought, this is how I'm going to run the deck. However, then speaking to Matt, I realised that he had a Tiamat that he wasn't using. So it suddenly became a 5-colour dragon deck rather than a Tiamat deck. So to make that work, there were several things that I've had to design and put into place. The first of which you actually don't see very much of in the gameplay video, is that it's also got an alternate win con of Maze's End in the deck. Now, you may have noticed that I was playing quite a few Guildgate tap lands, and I usually wouldn't put these in the deck because they're quite slow. However, I thought, I'm building a Dragon's Battle for Baldur's Gate deck. It would be a shame not to put the Gate win con in there. So, I had Maze's End in the deck. I've got all 19 gates that there is now, including the ones from Ravnica and the ones from Battle for Baldur's Gate. And it also kind of helps with the mana fixing being 5 colours. And in order to counteract the slowness of this, I also have in the deck Amulet of Vigour. So this means when the gates come in tapped, they untap. So suddenly, for very cheap, I've got basically dual lands. Now, to also deal with the mana fixing, with all these dragons flying around, and to make sure I can get to Tiamat as quick as possible, I have all of the diamonds in the deck. Again, they're all in this artwork, so that was kind of part of the thematic nature of the deck as well. And, they're not perfect, but with Amulet of Vigour out, they can come in untapped as well. I also had things like Druid of the Anima in there. So these are mana dorks that deliberately tap for mana of different colours to try and help with the mana fixing, as well as mana reducers. So things like Goblin and Archomancer and Animar, Soul of the Elements, to try and really bring down the cost of dragons so that I can play them quicker. So, talking about dragons, as this is a dragon deck, what are the key dragons in the deck? Well, I just put this deck together before the game. I had not played it in a multiplayer context. I'd only played a couple of games with Matt just to see how it ran, and we made some tweaks by adding more mana dorks, etc. But I think where I went wrong in the deck, in the game, is actually that I didn't get Mirim out the first time I dropped Tiamat. So Mirim is an essential part of the deck, I think, because just producing more and more dragons, more and more, ETBs, just bigger flyers in the air, it just makes the deck really go oomph. And actually, again, what I didn't realise is how powerful a card like Ganax was. So this is the dragon that whenever another dragon enters the battlefield, you create treasure tokens. And as you'll see in the back end of the game, this actually kind of self-perpetuates with Mirim out. You start producing more and more dragons, produce more and more tokens, produce more dragons, and it kind of just gets very silly. So I think Ganax actually, if I was to play the game again, I would go and get these two cards in the first drop of Tiamat. Another really useful card in the deck is something like Earthquake Dragon. Now, this is the big 10/10 Flampler that can cost just 1 green mana, and you can recur it from the graveyard. And I think this is a real threat in the air, especially when you've got damage doublers in the deck and things like that. It suddenly becomes a really hard thing to deal with unless you exile it. So that's a really important addition to the deck. The final dragon I want to talk about, though, is Clouth. Now, Clouth allows you to produce mana, X mana, in any combination of colours where X is the total power of attacking creatures, and Clouth has haste. So with Clouth and Tiamat out, suddenly you're swinging with both. You're getting 11 mana of whatever colour you want. And so you can just start to play out more dragons that you've already got with Tiamat, and it just gets very silly very quickly. But the other key element, I think, to the deck, and this did play out in the game as you'll have seen, is cards like Split the Spoils. And now this is recursion of the dragons. There is a strong chance you will get board wiped, which in Tiamat's case isn't too much of a problem because you just get Tiamat's ETB again. But for other dragons, once they're in the graveyard, you need ways of getting them out. And I think Split the Spoils is a really interesting and thematic way of doing that, and giving your opponent the choice between two different piles of very large dragons, I think, is just very fun. So that's a quick deck tech on what's in my Tiamat deck. And if you want to look at it further, find the Moxfield link below. And I'd love to hear your comments, ideas. You'll have noticed that it's actually quite a budget dragon deck. I haven't gone out and found all the best dragons there are in Magic, but I think it worked quite effectively. and I really look forward to playing with it in the future. So like, comment and subscribe to this video and our channel more generally, and it'll be great to hear your thoughts on my Tiamat.